Introduction. The Silence of God rises as one of those novels that transcends mere historical narration to become a dark and poetic mirror of the human soul. From its very first pages, the reader is transported into a world where faith, devotion, and power intertwine to weave a fabric impossible to unravel. A world in which the boundaries between salvation and damnation blur, and where blind obedience can prove as destructive as sin itself. This work does not simply recount events, it reconstructs atmospheres, delves into the psychology of its characters, and reveals the perpetual tension between the human and the divine, between life and death, between light and shadow. The main setting of the novel is a convent unknown to many, Santa Maria del Lanto, perched high upon a forgotten hill. This place unfolds as a microcosm of medieval Christendom, where sanctity and corruption, devotion and cruelty coexist with unsettling ease. Its walls, tall and solemn, are covered in frescoes depicting saints on their pilgrimages, yet under the wavering light of black candles and flickering tapers, they take on a macabre air, as though the very martyrs were gazing upon the world of the living with silent condemnation. Each cell, though adorned with gold and curtains woven in gilded thread, becomes a chamber of torment and spiritual experimentation, where the tears of the imprisoned are gathered as sacred relics and wielded as instruments of power. The image of the gilded prison serves not merely as historical decor, but as a symbol of the manipulation of the human spirit and the coercion of faith. At the heart of this narrative stands Isadora de Lunae, a woman whose strength, intelligence, and resolve are the very antithesis of the oppression that surrounds her. Her capture, the placing of ritualized shackles upon her wrists, and her confinement within a gilded cell represent, in both literary and symbolic terms, the struggle of the individual against a system that seeks to dominate not only the body but also the soul. Isadora is not merely a fictional character, she is inspired by historical accounts of women who resisted religious oppression, as well as by records of inquisitions and ecclesiastical trials that document the unrelenting tension between obedience and defiance. Through her, the novel explores how faith can become an instrument of resistance and, at the same time, how institutionalized power can deform and subjugate it. The apocalyptic tone of the work is introduced from the very first chapters. Isadora's tears, burning like acid upon contact with Sister Abigail's hands, later rising to form silver rivers in the air, become a metaphor for the power of the human spirit against institutional corruption. Each drop is an act of rebellion, a judgment that foretells the collapse of a system that has abused its authority for centuries. In parallel, the stigmata of Lucius, located within the Vatican and bleeding not as wounds of flesh but as fissures torn open in time itself, bind the supernatural to the historical, revealing that even the world's most powerful centers may be fractured by forces beyond human control. This apocalyptic thread not only heightens the narrative tension, but also transforms the story into a universal tale of the fall of empires, divine justice, and the inevitable confrontation between man and divinity, between imposed dogma and individual conscience. The work is grounded in a detailed and credible historical backdrop. Though many of the events are literary reconstructions, they are inspired by authentic records of the era, the structure of the Vatican, the practices of the Holy Office, convent life, and the intrigues that surrounded the cloisters. Every description, from the frescoes upon the walls to the ritual of the prisoner's tears, seeks to immerse the reader in a time when religion not only governed morality and destiny, but also served as an instrument of power, control, and oppression. The novel does not shy away from exploring institutionalized cruelty, nor from revealing how religious authority can transform spirituality into a mechanism of terror. The construction of the secondary characters is equally meticulous. Abigail, with her cold smile and relentless rigor, embodies the incarnation of extreme obedience and the perversion of sacred power, while Prioress Margarita symbolizes the blindness and despair of those who act without grasping the magnitude of the forces they have unleashed. The prisoners, from Elena to the more shadowy figures inhabiting the cells, compose a mosaic of suffering, resilience, and fractured hope, reminding us that even within the densest oppression, life and humanity endure, though in fragmented and vulnerable form. The rhythm of the novel alternates between the claustrophobic tension of the convent and the apocalyptic vastness of the events that unfold beyond its walls. The scenes within Santa Maria del Lanto, laden with poetic and apocalyptic symbolism, intertwine with depictions of natural and supernatural catastrophes, such as the black waters of the Tiber or the silver flow of Lucius's blood in the Vatican. These elements are not mere artifices, they serve as manifestations of divine judgment and of humanity's moral collapse, reminding the reader that Isadora's personal story is woven into a far greater fabric of chaos and revelation. One of the most striking aspects of The Silence of God is its language. The style weaves together historical precision with a poetic prose that borders on the apocalyptic. Descriptions of spaces, rituals, and torments intertwine with metaphors that evoke fire, shadow, and light, constructing an atmosphere where the sacred and the profane coexist in precarious balance. Every word, every adjective, every visual image contributes to a sense of inevitability that the events narrated are not only possible, but destined to unfold. This linguistic richness allows the reader not merely to witness the story, but to feel it, to live it in its physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions. The central theme of the novel revolves around power and resistance. Isadora is not merely a victim, she is a catalyst of transformation, a figure who exposes the contradictions of religious authority and the fragility of humanity before the divine. Her defiance, her tears, and her ability to preserve dignity in the face of torture become universal symbols of resistance and of the relentless pursuit of justice, even if only spiritual. The work raises questions that transcend the bounds of historical narrative. Can faith be genuine when it is imposed? What happens when devotion becomes an instrument of oppression? Does there exist a judgment that surpasses the corruption of men and institutions? Another crucial element is the supernatural dimension of the events. From the tears that transform into silver rivers to the stigmata bleeding at the very heart of the Vatican, the novel blends the historical with the fantastic in a convincing way. These supernatural elements do not undermine the story. On the contrary, they enrich it, imbuing it with an aura of prophecy and inevitable judgment. The fusion of the real and the extraordinary allows the work to function both as a historical novel and as a symbolic and philosophical tale on justice, redemption, and divine punishment. The historical and geographical backdrop is also crafted with meticulous care. Santa Maria del Lanto, set upon one of the 7 hills surrounding the city, is not merely a convent, it is a symbol of vigilance, control, and mystery. Its strategic location, its towering walls, and its neoclassical spires remind the reader of the omnipresence of ecclesiastical power and the near impossibility of escaping it. Every architectural and geographical detail is designed to reinforce the sense of claustrophobia, inevitability, and dramatic tension, immersing the reader in a space where every shadow may harbor a threat, and every light, a revelation. The book also explores the psychology of its characters with a depth seldom seen in historical novels. The blend of fear, devotion, and rebellion in figures such as Isadora, Abigail, and Prioress Margarita reveals not only their actions, but also the motivations that drive them. Every decision, every gesture, every word is infused with history, culture, and spirituality, creating a reading experience that is both rich and complex. Scenes of torture and suffering, however extreme, are presented with a poetic sensitivity that avoids gratuitousness, transforming violence into a vehicle for exploring the human condition and the struggle between good and evil, between faith and corruption, between freedom and submission. Likewise, the narrative unfolds within a broad temporal framework, connecting episodes of the past with their repercussions in the characters' present. The novel allows the reader to perceive that the actions of the men and women within the convent are not isolated, but rather part of a wider historical cycle, where devotion, betrayal, ambition, and divine justice intertwine in an inexorable weave. The perception of time in the work is fluid, at times linear, at others fragmented, evoking the way memory and history interact within the human mind, and how the errors and triumphs of the past reverberate into the present. In stylistic terms, The Silence of God weaves vivid descriptions with dialogues that not only drive the plot forward but also unveil the inner complexities of the characters. Internal monologues, poetic reflections, and scenes of spiritual confrontation allow the reader not merely to observe, but to experience the intensity of the narrative. Thus, the work becomes a bridge between history and emotion, between fact and reflection, turning each chapter into a sensory, intellectual, and emotional experience. Finally, it is important to note that The Silence of God is not a novel that seeks easy answers. On the contrary, it invites the reader to question, to reflect on the nature of power, faith, and justice. The work suggests that the true battle is not fought solely within the walls of a convent or the structures of an empire, but within every human heart, in the constant struggle between obedience and resistance, between accepting authority and affirming one's own dignity. In sum, this historical and apocalyptic novel is far more than a tale of oppression and resistance. It is a profound meditation on faith, morality, and justice. Through Isadora de Lunae, Sister Abigail, Prioress Margarita, and the other prisoners, the reader witnesses how individual acts can defy centuries of dogma and corruption, and how even in the darkest places the light of rebellion and redemption may emerge. The fusion of historical fact with supernatural elements, the poetic style, and the meticulous construction of characters and settings make The Silence of God a unique work, one that invites the reader to approach it with attention, reflection, and admiration for both the complexity of the human condition and the strength of the spirit in the face of entrenched power. Consequently, this book not only prepares the reader to plunge into the events of the first chapter, but also establishes an interpretive framework. Everything that will unfold within the walls of Santa Maria del Lanto and beyond them must be understood as part of a greater fabric of history, symbolism, and apocalyptic destiny. Violence, suffering, and miracles are not mere accidents. They are narrative and symbolic instruments that reflect the eternal struggle between obedience and freedom, between blind faith and critical conscience. The Silence of God offers no easy comfort, yet it promises an intense and transformative literary experience. Those who venture into its pages will find a story where every tear bears meaning, where every shadow conceals secrets, and where human history, in all its complexity, unfolds with both beauty and terror in a perfect balance between the historical and the apocalyptic, the human and the divine, the real and the poetic.
Book I, The Birth of Heresy, 1486 to 1500. Chapter 1, The Gospel That Burned the Pope's Hands. Psalm 64 verses 2 to 8. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the conspiracy of those who work iniquity, who sharpen their tongues like swords, and shoot bitter words like arrows. They suddenly fire upon the upright, and do not fear. They strengthen themselves in evil schemes. They plot how to lay hidden snares, saying, "Who will see them?" They devise injustices. They carry out a diligent search in the inward parts of each. In the depths of every heart lies iniquity, but God will strike them with his arrow. Suddenly their wound shall be upon them, the manuscript that no one was meant to find. Calixtus III would never admit the terrifying fear he felt as he descended that staircase, yet his hands, normally as steady as those of the finest military strategist of his age, trembled faintly as he held the torch that would guide him into the wolf's maw. In those morbid, desolate passageways, the air was so dense it left the lungs feeling hollow, filled only with the stench of dampness preserved through centuries, and with something else, something that smelled suspiciously of charred flesh. Holiness, this is madness, Cardinal Orsini had insisted barely an hour earlier, his thick fingers twisting around the hard relief of the golden crucifix he always carried. Then, between mutterings and half-formed thoughts, he hastily added, "The forbidden archives have been sealed since the pontificate of Boniface VIII. I do not believe it wise to meddle in matters the Church has so clearly deemed concluded." Then came a guilty silence, as though he were searching in Calixtus for some trace of condescension toward his naive request. Then, almost stammering, Orsini hastily replied once more, "Of course there are justified reasons for it, Your Holiness. Never doubt my eternal loyalty to the Holy Church, nor my absolute devotion to its sacred vocation of service to the Lord," he added in a cloying voice, like one attempting to mask fear beneath a veil of obedience, or perhaps to soften the possible consequences of reprisal at the hands of Calixtus. As expected, Calixtus smiled with that imperturbable calm which so often infuriated his enemies. And, standing tall with the majesty of one who bore upon his shoulders the weight and responsibility of centuries of tradition, he replied in a grave, unwavering voice, with the authority of a sovereign whose realm brushed against the very edges of the unimaginable. Precisely for that reason I must go, Cardinal Orsini. A pope who does not know the secrets of his predecessors is like a general who refuses to study the battles of the past. Now, as his weary feet descended the 77 stone steps, each one etched with strange and indecipherable symbols, he understood why so many popes had shunned that place. The walls seemed to exude a viscous substance that gleamed faintly beneath the wavering torchlight, a stony sweat that filled any who beheld it with both revulsion and shame. And though a nearby cascade pretended to wash away the sins of souls still wandering this world, the truth was otherwise. Those sins continued to pulse, indestructible, in the very entrails of the church itself. As the staircase neared its end, with every step he thought he heard whispers in dead tongues, Aramaic, perhaps, or something older still. In truth, he could not tell whether he had wandered into a dream or was caught in the starkness of waking. And just beyond, where their gaze could scarcely discern between shadows and flickering inner lights, the door at the foot of the staircase rose like a true masterpiece of intimidation. Carved from black ebony and reinforced with iron, said by legend to have been drawn from the mines of King Solomon, the door bore a bas-relief of St. Peter holding the keys to the kingdom of God. Yet when the torchlight flickered at a certain angle, the saint's features warped into the grotesque sneer of a demon, one that Calixtus recognized from his childhood nightmares. In an instant, the air turned frigid, as though each breath were being swallowed by the wood itself, and from the cracks in the frame seeped an acrid stench, a mingling of rusted iron and scorched flesh, a sacrilegious perfume impossible to mistake for anything human. Carved from black ebony and reinforced with iron, said by legend to have been drawn from the mines of King Solomon, the door bore a bas-relief of St. Peter holding the keys to the kingdom of God. Yet when the torchlight flickered at a certain angle, the saint's features warped into the grotesque sneer of a demon, one that Calixtus recognized from his childhood nightmares. In an instant, the air turned frigid, as though each breath were being swallowed by the wood itself, and from the cracks in the frame seeped an acrid stench, a mingling of rusted iron and scorched flesh, a sacrilegious perfume impossible to mistake for anything human. The key hung heavily from his neck, concealed beneath the reluctant folds of the papal cassock, as though the very fabric sought to guard its mysterious secret. Indeed, that curious artifact, deprived of the fame and renown it perhaps deserved, nonetheless held an incalculable value for the history of Christendom and of humanity itself. There it rested, adorned by the vivid gleams cast by the mingling lights of candles and tapers across the chamber's furrowed surface, as if an invisible hand had been charged with its eternal custody. Being an artifact seen by so very few, and by fewer still ever used, it hung there in silence, swaying with the uncertain rhythm between fear and reason, as though each slight movement measured the very fragility of destiny itself. As they watched, hypnotized, the tortuous dance of the great key toward the lock, upon whose main inscription gleamed a silver serpent devouring its own tail, forged, if rumor spoke true, from the 30 pieces of silver of Judas Iscariot, the metal remained unnaturally cold, as though it drew not only the warmth from his body but a portion of his very soul, as if within that dim shimmer pulsed a foreign will, patient and baleful. Click! The sound of the lock giving way echoed like the snap of a broken bone. The rush of air that escaped from within struck Calixtus with a gust of contradictory scents, perhaps something akin to aged wine, to rotting parchment, or to the myrrh of a forgotten altar, and beneath it all, that unmistakable metallic tang, sharp and thick, which he now recognized, with a shudder, as old blood. At first glance, his impression was that the forbidden archives bore no resemblance whatsoever to the Vatican library, so pristine and orderly. This was a cyclopean labyrinth of shelves and rusted reliquaries, sprawling like diseased roots across a vast expanse of treasures wrested from past conquests and unholy acquisitions. The passageways twisted like the stone entrails of some colossal beast, and in their fissures crouched millions of volumes and manuscripts that seemed to exhale a barely perceptible murmur, a chorus of drowned voices that shadowed every step. Amidst that suffocating tide of darkness, Calixtus caught sight of something that stopped him cold, as though an invisible hand had driven its claws into his chest. In a shadowed corner, a book bound in what seemed to be human skin leapt into his sight, its gilded titles writhing as though fleeing from his gaze, Intimate Confessions of the Borgias, Illustrated Edition. He knew at once that this was the very volume he had sought to bury beneath the weight of his accursed lineage, far from profane eyes, an unholy truth, condemned, that resisted with spectral fury every attempt to vanish. As he turned his gaze to the other side, he beheld a great number of grimoires wrapped in parchment sealed with black wax, stacked like playing cards upon a lavish gaming table, though in truth it seemed less a table than a profane altar disguised in splendor. And in one corner, what seemed to be a fetus preserved in formaldehyde, bearing 3 eyes, stirred faintly within its final glass prison, as if still seeking an impossible breath. A shiver ran down Calixtus's spine, and he wisely chose not to look twice. But at the center of the chamber, sanctuary of grotesque writings and accursed treasures condemned to oblivion, there rose a lectern of bone. Of what creature? Perhaps human, though it was better left unknown. There it lay, solemn and expectant, the object of his relentless quest, as if it had been waiting for centuries for the exact moment when reckless hands would dare to profane it. The Liber Carnis. The book, whispered of among the few who had ever dared to name it, was known as the sacrament of the redemption of the slain lamb and of his flesh. They said that within its pages was inscribed the promise of a corrupted salvation, an inverted gospel that demanded not faith, but flesh, not prayer, but blood. A blasphemous sacrament which, once spoken, echoed through the very entrails of the church itself. The cover throbbed with an almost organic pulse, as though it concealed within a buried heart. Coincidence or not, rumors whispered among the oldest cardinals claimed that this book, long thought a myth reserved for the Pope's most intimate circles, was bound in the skin of St. Bartholomew, the apostle flayed alive according to Holy Scripture. Its pages, translucent and fragile, resembled membranes torn from unbaptized infants, capable of chilling the blood of even the most intrepid and ambitious cardinal. Suddenly, the book leapt into his palms before he could so much as brush it, as though it had been waiting for him across the centuries. It was in that instant that he understood, or at least believed he understood, what was truly taking place. The pain was instantaneous, so intense that it stole his vision for a moment. The cover clung to his skin like a ravenous leech, and the pages began to stir, as if awakening from a long slumber, rearranging themselves into a message traced in his own blood. From them poured visions and revelatory epiphanies, sharp fragments of a future in which he was to rise as the champion of his own destiny. Yet that destiny was not born entirely of his own will, but of creative hands whose brilliance was impossible to discern. Did it emanate from the incorruptible light of the Most High, or from the perpetual shadow of the adversary? Perhaps from both, as though salvation and damnation were merely two faces of the same unfathomable design. Suddenly, amid his transcendent visions, he heard a voice, clear and sonorous, too pure to belong entirely to this world, yet too near for him not to question its origin. To you, Calixtus, called Pope by men, but not by God, I speak from the womb of time. Your seed shall bear the cross of your sin, and with it shatter the walls of this profane house. Yet unknown to you shall remain whether that which awaits at the end of your days is judgment or redemption. Behind him, Orsini fell to his knees with a stifled scream. The cardinal's golden crucifix melted like butter in the sun, scorching his clothes and the skin beneath. The figure of Christ, now liquid, slithered down his cassock before solidifying on the floor, forming a clear word in Aramaic. Cursed. In the distance, the shadows in the corners of the chamber thickened under a dense haze of grey dust. From them emerged figures Calixtus knew all too well, Archbishop della Rovere, with his icy smile and those blue eyes that never reflected light, and behind him, the hunched silhouette of Brother Metatron of the Custode Silentiae, better known as the Custodians of Silence. According to curious tongues, their adepts had forged secular pacts with the oldest and most prestigious families of the Holy Roman Empire. Later, they cultivated close alliances with the Catholic monarchs of Spain and France. Even earlier still, from the dawn of Christianity, that mysterious order had made its transcendental and shadowed presence felt, always watching, always patient, always measured. Undoubtedly, from that moment on, that order revealed itself as far more than a mere faithful witness. It was the invisible hand that, in the shadows, shaped and guided every step of that small giant, the complicit and perpetual shadow of a destiny moving inevitably toward a thunderous unfolding. There stood Brother Metatron, his face frozen before all, made all the more disturbing by the presumptuous silence he radiated, remaining motionless, barely discernible beneath a hood stitched with dried gut. From that garment issued a nauseating stench, rancid ferment, sour sweat, and bitter herbs, accompanied by a sticky vapor that seemed to cling to the skin and tangle in the throat with every breath. "You should not have come," whispered Della Rovere. Though his lips remained still, his words rang out with clarity and gravity. Every pope who opens this book signs his own sentence and his doom. Rise, then, and present your culpable transgression before the eyes of the Lord, who is abundant in mercy and slow to anger. As Della Rovere spoke his declaration, the liber carnis burned with a pure blue fire that emitted no heat, only a cold capable of making teeth chatter and bones shudder. Its pages twisted like serpents, and from their edges ran threads of crimson blood that embedded themselves into Calixtus's arms, inscribing messages in tongues that had not been spoken since the fall of the Tower of Babel. At that very moment, somewhere in Rome, a woman named Isadora de Lunae awoke screaming, her sheets soaked in a thick amniotic fluid that smelled of myrrh and copper. Her trembling hands instinctively sought her belly, where a scar she did not remember having throbbed with a sharp, living pain. Simultaneously, in the catacombs beneath St. Paul outside the walls, a choir of children's voices began mysteriously chanting the Dies Irae. When the Praetorian guards arrived and drew their gleaming swords, they found no one, only puddles of boiling holy water. On the walls, carved with childish fingernails, could be read some chilling words. "The hour has come. The Red Pope is born." Calixtus, though stunned and stripped of his own will, did not yet know it, but he had just ignited the fuse of the perfect storm. Those flames soon died out, turning into the ashes of the accursed book, which whirled through the air like dancers and reassembled with an almost autonomous will, tracing the fevered outline of an angelic child. His face, with features unnervingly clear, approached a perfection so supernatural it could not be attributed to human lineage. From that androgynous nature, at once angelic and bestial, emanated a brazen insolence in the face of its own manifestation. Calixtus swallowed, as if the simple act could ease the dryness that suddenly parched his throat. He knew he was facing something beyond all human comprehension, and yet his eyes could not turn away from the vision. "What have I done?" murmured Calixtus, barely audible, as if he feared the very air would return the answer. All he could think was, "What have I done?" This is going to require more than blind faith. And a couple of Our Fathers certainly won't be enough. Then, the silence of 1,000 secrets seized the place, until it was torn apart by a mournful groan. And Calixtus, caught between awe and reverence, spoke. How can a man of flesh and bone completely renounce his nature, when every heartbeat reminds him that he is mortal? How can a fragile soul, born of dust and fear, claim to be worthy of loving the Lord? Was it not sin that man paid as the price for seeing the light? And if that is so, would not grace then be an impossible gift, doomed to crumble in the hands of man? Who sinned first, man or God? Man or God, for allowing light within perfect darkness? After all, the light of a candle exists only because the shadow embraces it. And if that is so, why not forge a fertile abyss where a soul of God may reveal itself in its purest essence, rise above the mundane, and behold itself victorious in the mirror of its own divinity? The prophecy that condemned Rome. In that commotion, a fragment of parchment detached from the book and began to consume itself in a fire that gave neither heat nor shadow. Blue flames danced silently across the secret chamber. The words inscribed on the human skin resisted the combustion, glowing with a supernatural radiance before fading into the air. Calixtus III, his palms still smoky and numb from contact with the accursed text, watched as the smoke spiraled upward, tracing in its dance the fall of empires doomed to exist only in the memory of time. Beside him, Cardinal Orsini stifled a shudder as the ashes began to stir on their own, as if an invisible hand were shaping them with the patience of a potter molding clay. "Your Holiness, this transcends all comprehension," murmured the cardinal, and in his usually calculating eyes, an unprecedented fissure appeared, pure fear, naked uncertainty. The spirals of ash rose, gradually compacting until they suggested an uncertain symbol, a broken crown, or perhaps a skull with a halo. The air vibrated around that ephemeral figure, wavering between the divine and the sacrilegious, while each particle burned with a light that seemed to devour time itself. The burning particles rose in a hypnotic vortex, first forming an amorphous mass that gradually took on human features, a childlike forehead, sunken cheeks, lips parted in a silent scream of mysterious and orderly manifestation. Within seconds, the face of a child no older than 5 floated above the embers, with hollow eyes, 2 black abysses set into the spectral whiteness of the charred ashes, following the Pope's every movement with a supernatural intensity. "By the blood of Christ," cursed one of the guards, stumbling back until he slammed against the marble wall, his sword clattering noisily to the floor. The ash child opened its mouth in a silent scream that reverberated directly in their minds, a howl of atrocious anguish that forced even the stoic Orsini to clutch his ears, seized by an unbearable pain. Tears of ash began to slide from those hollow eyes, and wherever they touched the marble, the stone barely melted, inscribing characters that burned fleetingly before solidifying. "It's Hebrew," whispered Calixtus in a hoarse voice, his papal composure cracking for the first time in decades. Orsini bent down to examine the markings, his cassock brushing against the still smouldering embers. "What does it say, Your Holiness?" The Pope swallowed hard before replying. "One of yours will weep for all, and his tears shall be fire." In that very instant, before the face vanished completely, all present swore they saw the ash child's pupils transform into perfect stars of David. The detail was enough for the veteran guard from Granada to cross himself frantically, murmuring halting prayers as if he feared the very air could hear him. The silence that followed was so dense that the faint crackle of the cooling embers echoed like thunder through the emptiness of a valley. Suddenly, without warning, the chimney erupted with a shuddering roar. An icy wind sprang from nowhere, lashing the walls and forcing the flames to rise in columns of incandescent blue, grotesquely illuminating the pale faces of those present. And from that fire emerged a voice, or, rather, 1,000 voices intertwined in a single scream, a chorus of agony that resounded simultaneously in Latin and Aramaic. "It is already too late." The echo shook the silver candelabras and stirred the tapestries, as if the very walls wished to crumble. The Granada guard fell to his knees, his sword clattering to the floor as he lost strength, and cried out with a voice broken by terror. "It is the same clamor I heard at the burnings of the Converso Jews." Calixtus glared at him, his eyes burning with a mixture of wrath and sacred dread. "What blasphemies do you dare speak, soldier?" The man trembled like a child in a storm, lifting his face in supplication. "In Granada, Your Holiness, when we were purging the false conversos." In their final moments, some shouted those very words, in that accursed tongue that brings only ruin and chaos. The Pope and Orsini exchanged a heavy glance, laden with silent understanding. They had awakened something that should never have opened its eyes. With a sharp gesture, Calixtus swept the remaining ashes with the edge of his white robe. But instead of falling to the floor, the particles clung to the fabric as if alive, spreading out to delineate a meticulous map of Rome, where the Vatican blazed in red flames. "It is nothing but dust and superstition," the Pope shouted, shaking his robe in fury. The ashes, obeying a will of their own, fell to the floor, only to rearrange themselves into a single word written in Latin, mendax. The guards held their breath, the air grew heavy as lead. Orsini visibly paled, his lips brushing against a silent prayer. And then, as if to tear the silence with a knife of sarcasm, he murmured with bitter irony, "At least it has a sense of humor, whatever it is that has done all this." Calixtus drew a deep breath, his unfriendly gaze betraying the storm contained behind his eyes. Then, restoring the solemn mask of his papal authority, he spoke with tempestuous calm. "What have you seen today?" Silence was the only answer. "I asked what you have seen," he suddenly burst out, striking the floor with his pastoral staff. The impact thundered through the chamber, a resounding crash of power that made even the stones tremble. The Granada Guard was the first to break that oppression. His voice erupted like a strangled cry, born more of instinct than of will. "Nothing, Your Holiness, just a parchment that burned like any other." The others nodded with an almost hysterical fervor, like shipwrecked souls clinging to a plank in the midst of a storm. An ironic smile, tinged with satisfaction, appeared on Calixtus' lips. "Good children of the Church, and remember, God loves you." But as he left the chamber, the ashes, still restless on the floor, whispered one final word that only Orsini could hear. "Accomplice." The cardinal shuddered. For the first time in his ecclesiastical career, he questioned the value of the silence he had so long preserved. That night, while Rome slept beneath its mantle of stone and silence, an inexplicable wind swept through the halls of the Vatican. The ashes, which the servants had meticulously cleaned, reappeared, or perhaps had never truly gone, on the papal bedchamber floor, forming on the marble a symbol no Christian cleric would recognize, yet any rabbi would have identified at once: the Hebrew letter Aleph, the beginning of all things. At dawn, as the first golden light gilded the dome of St. Peter's, the laundresses discovered the Pope's robe. It was impeccably white, save for a stain in the shape of a small child's hand, right over the heart, a mark impossible to erase, no matter how vigorously they scrubbed with swabs and sage. Meanwhile, deep within the secret archives, the parchment that everyone believed reduced to ashes began to regenerate slowly, like an endless nightmare refusing to fade. Its letters emerged one by one, like open wounds that would never heal, as if the very flesh of the world were being written and torn apart simultaneously, condemned to repeat itself eternally in the perpetual birth of the spawn of evil, man. Chapter 2, The Alchemist and the Pope's Pact. Psalm 2 verses 1 to 6. Why do the nations conspire? And the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the princes gather together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us break their chains and cast off their cords from us. He who dwells in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord will mock them. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them with his fury. But I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." The impossible choice. The air in the secret dungeons beneath the Sistine Chapel was thick, heavy with the scent of melted wax, cold sweat, and something else, something that hinted at the arcane, like old blood drying in the cracks of the stone. Now, the torches cast twisted shadows that writhed like restless specters across the imposing walls. Calixtus III descended the marble steps with measured resolve, determined to find answers, as his white robe brushed against the dust and moisture-stained treads. At his side, Cardinal Orsini gripped a silver crucifix with a trembling hand and cautious step. "Your Holiness, this is madness," whispered Orsini, his eyes fixed on the depths of the corridor. "That woman is not human. The guards say the chains do not touch her, that they melt like wax whenever they try to hold her." Calixtus said nothing. His mind still lingered on the words of the cursed manuscript he had burned 3 nights ago: "One of your children shall judge you." At the end of the corridor stood an oak door reinforced with iron, where 2 guards clad in black armor, the so-called ravens of the Vatican, kept vigil. "Open it," commanded the Pope. The creak of the hinges sounded like a wail. There, within the cell, a shadow, human or otherwise, gradually revealed itself, where Isadora de Lunae awaited. She was not chained. It was unnecessary. She sat in the center of the stone floor, legs crossed beneath her simple gray linen dress, stained with dried herbs, and was that blood? Her hands, as delicate as parchment, rested on her knees, palms facing upward. Between her fingers, a silver thread glimmered, woven into shapes that, reproachfully, captivated the gaze, and there, clearly visible, a Star of David intertwined with a cross shone in luminous shades of white and gold. "You have tarried, Vincenzo," she said without lifting her gaze. Her voice was soft, polite, and utterly inhuman. "For days since you burned the parchment. For nights in which Rome has dreamed of fire." Calixtus shuddered at the sound of his given name. No one had uttered it since his coronation as supreme pontiff. "What are you?" he demanded, taking a step forward. The air now smelled of sulfur and myrrh. Finally, Isadora lifted her head. Her eyes were two pupil-less chalices, brimming with liquid gold that radiated its own light, burning in the shadows like an eternal fire, restrained yet expectant. "You say you can give me an heir," Calixtus said, suppressing a tremor. "The doctors say I am sterile." Isadora laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Fool," Isadora replied. "Have you not seen those manifestations throughout Rome? How can you resist believing in the signs from heaven?" "None of that. You were the witch marked by fire, destined to burn that night of the full moon in March, in the first year of my pontificate. I remember you, a spectre among the flames, on the wretched pyre raised at the cursed edges of Rome, where heretics and criminals surrender their last breath to the smoke, and the ashes mingle with prayers never heard. Beneath the iron shadow of the Malleus Maleficarum, your sentence was inscribed like red-hot iron upon the flesh of history. And yet, against the laws of men and above the justice demanded by hell itself, I tore you from the jaws of the fire. Do not speak to me, then, with insolence. Though a pagan witch, though a daughter of the forbidden, no one can deny the power that flows from your hands nor the storm your words awaken. But remember, the wisest, the most prudent course, is the mantle of silence, that veil which covers all and protects the fragile memory of mortals. For that day which should never have been born under the first light of the sun, was a shared sin, a blood pact sealed in shadow, and it shall be buried in the same grave where truth and falsehood lie entwined. Do you think I speak of sowing my womb like a plowman sows wheat?" Her fingers tugged at the silver thread she had carried through idle days, and it hummed through the air with a musical tension. "I offer you a child born of the word itself, not of flesh, forged in the living promises of Christ the Redeemer, not in the sin that dwells within human nature." Isadora rose abruptly, with a movement so sudden it seemed instantaneous, and the thread in her hands began to blaze with a blue flame. Then, the shadows on the wall screamed as if they possessed a voice of their own. "First option," declared Isadora, and instantly the fire leapt, tracing overwhelming letters in the air that glowed like freshly forged, searing iron. "A child who will save souls, yet reduce your throne to dust and ruin." Then, the flames unveiled visions in which crowds knelt before a youth with a luminous face, while behind him, the papal palaces were devoured by ravenous fire. "Second option," she proclaimed, and instantly the fire turned a deep crimson, as if the very blood of the world had been summoned to dance within the flames. "No child, and Rome will crumble before the cold of your tomb seals your name." Now, the flames revealed empty streets, the Vatican reduced to rubble, and something with too many eyes, slinking through the debris like a foreboding omen. Orsini collapsed to his knees, babbling in Latin amid sobs and spasms, a frantic murmur that sounded less like a prayer and more like a desperate delirium. Calixtus felt a shiver crawl up his spine, as if an icy finger had traced each vertebra one by one. Calixtus's voice, barely audible, seemed to freeze the very air around him, the weight of inevitability pressing down with a force that no mortal crown could counter. "All choices are just that, choices," Isadora replied, her voice laced with serene irony. "Which do you prefer? The love and devotion of a people you will never truly know, or the power that, though fleeting, you will feel blaze in your very hands?" The Pope fixed his gaze on the flames, on those visions where his legacy lay reduced to ashes, a decayed church, subjugated and dragged along by the designs of usurping kingdoms. Then he drew a deep, steadying breath. "Give me the child," Isadora lowered her lids over her unflinching golden eyes. When she lifted them again, they gleamed, swollen with silver tears. "Then you have condemned us to a decadent end, judged by our own hands," she murmured. "Then you have condemned us to a decadent end, meted out by our own hands," she murmured solemnly. And in that moment, the walls of the cell bled a barrel of shadows and memory. It was only the beginning of what was yet to come. The price of ambition. Isadora's final words still echoed against the stone walls when the dungeon floor began to quake. A violent wind erupted from nowhere, tearing the tapestries from the walls and snuffing out the torches. In the sudden darkness, only Isadora's golden eyes remained, hovering like two cursed moons in the blackness of a night without dawn. Calixtus instinctively stumbled backward, his papal robes tangling around his feet. "Your Holiness!" Orsini shouted, stretching a trembling hand toward him. Yet the Pope could not tear his eyes away from Isadora, whose silhouette was beginning to glow with a ghostly radiance. "You have made your choice, Vincenzo," Isadora intoned, her voice no longer human. It reverberated like 1,000 whispers in unison, like an entire forest murmuring ancient secrets. "But every pact has its price." With a gesture of absolute certainty, Isadora extended her scarred arms. Suddenly, the chains that had once seemed to bind her clattered to the floor, transforming into writhing silver serpents that twisted and dissolved into the air. The Pope's guards crossed their spears with trembling hands, yet Isadora merely smiled, utterly untroubled. "Do you think I need to escape?" she asked, and her biting laughter made the stained glass windows of the upper chapel shiver. "No, Pontiff, now I am your prisoner more than ever." Calixtus felt a cold sweat crawl down his spine. What have you done?" he murmured, watching as the walls of the cell began to bleed a thick, black liquid that smelled of the rinse of purified sins, now tinged with the chiaroscuro of hues that split and twisted as the sins of heretics transformed into those of converted adherents. "These are the plagues that Moses once prophesied," Isadora said, as a swirl of shadows danced around her. "But now, destruction, or heresy, rests in your choice. A choice that will leave no one untouched by grave consequences, though at least you will possess a fleeting sense of free will against what is already inscribed in the books of God, written by the hands of men." Then, Isadora caught the mutual complicity in Calixtus's eyes. Suddenly, words were superfluous in the presence of that unspoken affirmation. "I have accepted your choice," he replied. "But the child who is to be born will not be of your blood, but of your sin. He will not inherit your eyes, but your ambition. And when the time comes..." There was a silence as Calixtus continued to wait for the final words to fall from Isadora's lips, and he asked, "And when the time comes, what will happen?" "Fool!" Isadora snapped, stretching out a hand to touch Calixtus's chest. His papal robe blackened entirely at her touch. "It will judge you with the same mercy you have shown today." At that moment, a thunderous roar shook the very foundations of the Vatican. In the upper chapels, the fortifications, and the outer atriums of the sacred palace, the faithful cried out as they witnessed every crucifix simultaneously overturning. The Tiber, visible from the high windows, began to bubble, its waters turning black as ink in the scriptorium of an exiled scribe. Suddenly, Orsini appeared, collapsing to his knees and retching bile. "Your Holiness, this is the work of the devil," he shouted between heaves. But Calixtus could not tear his gaze away from Isadora, whose face now radiated an infinite sorrow. "No, Your Eminence," the Pope whispered, his voice hoarse, "this is the work of my own ambition." Isadora regarded him slowly. "You understand at last," she murmured. Then, with a movement too swift to follow, she plucked a lock of her own hair and placed it into Calixtus's hand. The moment it touched his skin, the hair transformed into a tiny parchment, on which a single phrase was inscribed in blood. "One of your own will judge you, and their blood shall be the price." The same prophecy he had read days before, amidst fleeting epiphanies that revealed, from beginning to end, the hidden destinies meant for mortal eyes, as if no time or space existed for doubt. "Keep it well, Vincenzo, Isadora whispered, as the guards finally lunged to seize her. She offered no resistance, she merely smiled with an unsettling calm. For when he comes, it will be all that remains of you, the last echo of your name lost in eternity. As they dragged her from the cell, Isadora turned her head to cast one final glance at Calixtus. In that instant, the Pope saw something that made him recoil, tugging at the folds of his own cassock. Reflected in her golden eyes was his own face, Christ's lamb grown old and emaciated, mouth agape in an eternal scream of terror, the final harbinger of an embodied apocalypse. Then the doors slammed shut, leaving Calixtus alone with the echo of Isadora's final words reverberating through the chamber. But that echo did not die with the silence, it clung to the walls like an invisible curse, vibrating through the blackened stained glass and the very foundations of the Vatican, as if the stone itself were endlessly repeating the prophecy. And though the Pope closed his eyes, the words continued to beat within his chest, striking with the force and brilliance of a curse no prayer could ever dispel. Even the stones of the Vatican seemed to resonate in rhythm with his resolute confession. You have condemned us all. Chapter 3, The Birth in the Chapel of the Damned. Psalm 91 verses 5 to 8. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that lays waste at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. Open your eyes, and you will behold the punishment of the wicked, the cursed birth. The most forsaken crypt beneath the apostolic library appeared on no Vatican map. Yet Calixtus III had unearthed it years earlier, back in his days as cardinal, when he prowled among forbidden manuscripts in search of Arab alchemical treatises and ancient grimoires. The place, hidden behind an oak cabinet bound in iron, had once been sealed by decree of a former pope, entered in the secret registers under a single name, the Chamber of Expiation. Now, with Rome plunged into chaos, foreign armies encamped at the city's gates, harvests ruined by an inexplicable plague, and the people whispering of the world's end, Calixtus returned to that accursed place. Not out of curiosity, not out of ambition, but out of a necessity endured, as bitter as it was inevitable. The air in the crypt was thick, almost sacred in its decay, saturated with the scent of melted wax, damp earth, and something older still, the metallic breath of dried blood that clung to the stone walls like a profane sacrament. The torches flickered, their flames gasping as if on the verge of death, casting twisted shadows that tangled together like specters in penance. From the niches, the bones of heretics condemned in the days of the first Roman pope stared into the present with hollow sockets, their skulls frozen in eternal grins, as though mocking the fate of mankind. And among them, an unbroken chain of mausoleums rose like a stone via crucis, its somber memory dragging behind it the centuries of atonement and desecrated sins. Calixtus adjusted the papal stole, feeling the weight of the small parchment pressed against his chest, that solitary message, that written damnation. And above all, Isadora's words resounded in his mind more than ever, with the inexorable constancy of the dying candles whose wax dripped onto the cold, undefined floor like petrified tears. Around him, the emptiness of shadow seemed to veil the perpetual foulness of that accursed place, as though the darkness itself guarded a secret too deep to be revealed to mortals. Calixtus, his hands unsteady, unfurled the parchment in the gloom. The blood with which it had been inscribed had not dried, it throbbed like an open wound, glowing crimson upon the yellowed skin. Then, slowly, the words carved themselves into dreadful clarity. A son who will save the church, yet bring its power to ruin. The echo of that sentence seared into his chest like a branding iron. And though the crypt lay in silence, Calixtus thought he heard Isadora's voice whispering each syllable, as if fate itself had been inscribed against him. At his side, Cardinal Orsini coughed, pressing a vinegar-soaked cloth to his nose. The stench of the crypt bit into his lungs like a corrosive poison, and his clouded eyes glimmered under the wavering torchlight. "Your Holiness," he murmured, his voice fractured, almost pleading. "Why return to this lair of the damned? neither prayers nor exorcisms can cleanse what festers here below. But Calixtus did not answer. His fingers clung to the parchment as though he feared it might vanish the instant he let it go, while the sentence written in blood burned ever brighter in his memory. Calixtus did not respond. His gaze was fixed upon the heart of the crypt, where the custodians of silence, hooded monks whose faces were never revealed, were etching, with skeletal fingers, a circle of salt and ashes. At their head moved Brother Metatron, their leader, of whom wicked tongues whispered he had been born without a navel, a mark of one not conceived as other men. His very presence seemed to warp the shadows, as if the darkness itself acknowledged him. In perfect silence, he traced symbols upon the ground with a yellowed femur, and from the stigmata gaping in his palms dripped beads of blood that hissed and sputtered upon the coals and ashes, as though the wounds themselves, alive, sentient, were complicit in the rite. "It is ready," declared a woman's voice from the shadows. It belonged to none of the hooded figures. It was older, heavier, resonating as though it had not risen from a throat, but from the very stones of the crypt itself. A frozen murmur rippled through the mausoleums, and the candles flickered as if an unseen breath had descended from above. The custodians froze, bowing their heads to the ground in a gesture of trembling reverence. Calixtus and Orsini exchanged a fleeting glance, neither dared to ask who, or what, he had spoken. Isadora emerged from between the columns, flanked by two guards whose swords quivered in their hands. She wore no chains. No shackles bound her. Yet something in her bearing, the way she dragged her steps, as though burdened by an unseen weight, betrayed that she was not there of her own accord. Her gown, torn at the edges, seemed to ripple without wind, as though it breathed in unison with her. The custodians of silence bowed their heads at her approach, not in obedience, but in fear. Brother Metatron lifted his gaze and, for the first time in years, stilled his blood-stained hand over the unfinished circle. The silence grew heavier still, so thick that even the dripping of wax ceased. Then Isadora spoke, her resounding voice cleaving through the gloom like a piercing blade. "It was not I who came. I was summoned." Her golden eyes found Calixtus's in the dimness, amid the dying candles and torches that seemed to falter beneath that gaze. The Pope felt the parchment hidden against his chest burn, as though brushed by an unseen flame. For an endless instant, there were no guards, no custodians, no sacred circle, only two gazes entwined, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, awaiting the outcome of that silent recognition. The whisper of the bones in their niches, or perhaps of the air itself, seemed to shape a single sentence that no one dared to speak aloud. The prophecy had begun to unfold. "You have come to behold your ruin, Vincenzo," she declared, letting the profane name tear through the pontifical vestments like a rent veil. "Or your salvation. Destiny still awaits your choice." In the gloom, her voice was no mere sound, but a breath that shook stone and flame alike, as though the crypt itself acknowledged in those words the echo of a judgment already inscribed in the abyss. And in that instant, as though her word had torn the very veil of the world, every candle died at once. The chamber was plunged into a darkness so dense it did not merely consume the light, but seemed to swallow the bodies of those present, dissolving them into the mute eternity of a nameless shadow. "Vincenzo," she spoke once more, breaking the silence and returning to him a name he had not heard in months. "That will be your ruin, or your salvation. You have not yet decided." The Pope clenched his fist around the staff, and as he did, the veins stood out upon his hand like the ancient roots of the cedars of Lebanon, carving across his skin with the severity of a contained force that threatened to tear him apart from within. "I shall fulfill my part of the pact," he declared, and though his voice rang firm, within him it quivered. "But the child shall be raised under the sacred custody of the Church, and he shall know no other guardian than the Holy Empire of Rome." Isadora smiled, and the shadows recoiled beneath the weight of that grimace. Her teeth, too white, too perfect, gleamed with a cynical ambiguity, impossible for any creature born of this world. In that fleeting glimmer, the truth was laid bare, the inhuman nature that until then had remained concealed. he has already chosen his tutor, Isadora declared with a stone-carved certainty, as though she were not speaking for herself but with the voice of a design older than the very conception of man. And so her words hung in the crypt like immovable slabs, heavy with the weight of a truth that could never be revoked. Her eyes, wholly black, stripped of pupils and reflection, exuded an ancient gleam of disdain, like a secret guarded since the very birth of graves. In that unfathomable abyss of superhuman insight, the Pope thought he glimpsed a knowledge that should never be spoken, and a judgment whose sentence already pressed upon his soul. The chill that coursed through his veins did not belong entirely to this world. "Let us begin," said the old woman. And her voice, like the imprint of a final seal, shattered the sepulchral silence of the crypt of the child born in ritual. And in that moment, the candles withered in unison, slowly dissolving until they were utterly consumed, and the shadow reclaimed, serene and implacable, that which had belonged to it for centuries. The signs of the end. The cry of Lucius rang out between glory and dread, like thunder rending the entrails of the Vatican. The sound pierced the heavy stone walls and spread through all of Rome, embedding itself into the very fabric of reality, as though it touched the alma mater of the world. In the instant the newborn opened his eyes for the first time, those present felt the outer world shift, an uncanny stillness descended upon the city, gentle as a balm laid over the wounds festering in the reputation of the Holy Church. Yet beneath that accursed quiet, there pulsed an omen none dared to name. Calixtus III, still shaken by the ritual birth he had just witnessed, felt the air thicken around him, as though the crypt itself were holding its breath. The tallow candles, sole sentinels of that twilight gloom, flickered convulsively before dying in a single exhalation, plunging the chamber into utter darkness. Then, for 3 interminable seconds that seemed to suspend time itself, no sound was heard but the ragged gasps of those present and the ominous creak of the bones embedded in the walls, as if the very ornaments of the rite were stirring beneath a secret too ancient to remain unspoken. When the light returned, wavering through the candles, it was Cardinal Orsini who dared to shatter the fragile calm. His voice, trembling like a thread on the verge of breaking, barely rose above the suffocating weight that hung within the crypt. "Your Holiness, something is happening above," murmured the Cardinal, his eyes wide with an instinctive, almost bestial terror. "The servants speak of transformations in the city." Calixtus, clutching Lucius tight against his chest, lifted his gaze toward the crypt's vault as if his eyes could pierce the slab of stone and reach the city that awaited beyond. In that fevered tension he thought he glimpsed a different dawn, uncertain, fragile, for within himself he knew that nothing would ever be the same. When at last he spoke, his voice emerged hoarse, torn between fear and the brittle authority that still remained to him. "What kind of changes?" he asked, though deep within he already knew the answer, and dreaded hearing it spoken by another's lips. Before Orsini could so much as reply, a guard burst into the chamber, his armor clanging with each desperate step like a metallic omen. He tore off his helm, revealing a face drenched in cold sweat, distorted by a panic no longer of men, but of the damned. "The crucifixes," he gasped, his voice raw, torn by the chaos raging in the streets. "Throughout the entire city, they have turned. Christ hangs upside down in every church, every chapel, even upon the humblest altars of the people." A shiver crept down Calixtus's spine, freezing his very marrow. He turned his gaze toward Isadora, slumped in a corner as though exhaustion had overtaken her. Yet her golden eyes remained open, fixed upon him, burning with an implacable lucidity no weariness could extinguish. "What have you done?" the Pope spat, his voice intertwining accusation with the terror of his own helplessness, a naked tremor beneath the fragile mask of his office. Isadora smiled faintly, her indelible lips trembling as she spoke words that seemed to spring not from her breath, but from a fleeting sigh borrowed from the tomb itself. "It is not my doing, Vincenzo, it is yours." Her gaze fell upon the child cradled in the pontiff's arms. And in the fragile eyes of the newborn, vast oceans where frigates bound for the new world floated, witnesses to eternal greed and relentless conquest, impossible within so frail a flesh, burned a light that was not human. There throbbed the wisdom of buried ages, the echo of a long-awaited judgment. Then the entire crypt groaned like a womb cracking open. The walls wept salt, the stones creaked with a millennial lament, and dust fell from the ceiling like ash. Outside, a roar tore through the skies of Rome, the thunder of a heaven splitting in two, like the blade of a divine guillotine descending upon the necks of the unbelievers, those who refuse to accept Christ as Redeemer and the Church as its collector. And all understood, in a silence fiercer than any scream, that this was no birth. It was the opening of the final seal. It was the beginning of the end. Brother Metatron, hitherto silent as the tomb whose visage he seemed to inhabit, advanced with his characteristic and unsettling shuffle. The rough scrape of his feet against the cold slabs chilled the blood of those present, as if it were not a man marching through the crypt, but a corpse toward its own funeral. "It is not the only sign," he whispered, his voice cavernous and stripped of all human trace, resonating like an echo born from the other side of the veil. "The Tiber, its waters have turned as black as a moonless night, carrying with them a stench that does not belong to this world." Calixtus felt the world tilt beneath his feet, as if the very stones of the crypt had lost their support. His throat dried as he tried to speak, and only a broken murmur managed to escape his lips. "Black," he repeated, clutching the word like a plank amid a shipwreck, searching in vain for an earthly explanation, a shred of reason within the chaos. But reason, he understood deep within his being, no longer had a dwelling in Rome. As Brother Metatron's words still vibrated through the crypt, Lucius, seemingly in response to the chaos he had unleashed without full awareness, suddenly reached out his tiny hand. His fingers closed around Calixtus's finger with an unrelenting force, disproportionate for a newborn who had barely tasted the air of this world. And it was then that, from the depths of the city, a sound emerged that took everyone by surprise, first a single toll, then another, until it became the ceaseless ringing of all the bells of Rome. No acolyte was in the bell towers, no human hand set them vibrating. Yet they rang on their own, in unison, as if every tower, every bronze, every echo in the ancient stone responded to the same terrible summons. The entire city was being called to judgment. 3 days, murmured Brother Metatron, as blood welled from his stigmata, as if Golgotha itself were being torn anew. For 3 days the waters will remain black. Like the plagues of Egypt. As in the ancient days of Moses. For men have usurped the house of the Most High, and Rome has donned the robes of Pharaoh. Calixtus gazed at the child in his arms, peaceful and serene, yet those eyes, belonging not to an infant, revealed with terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. This was no trivial change, like the annexation of territories conquered by papal armies, but something germinating from the very depths of every soul. Rome had been altered forever, and the Holy Father, in his boundless ambition to save it, might have condemned it along with all its inhabitants. Chapter 4, The Order That Knew Too Much. Psalm 94 verses 20 to 23. Shall the throne of iniquity conspire with you? Which works oppression under the guise of law? They gather against the life of the righteous, and condemn the blood of the innocent. But the Lord has been my refuge, and my God a rock of my trust. He will bring back upon them their iniquity, and destroy them in their own wickedness. The Lord our God will destroy them. The custodians of silence. After the Dantean birth in that ritual sealed with blood and smoke, Calixtus III, his tiara fallen and papal robe stained with the fluids of childbirth and the bitter resins of the rite, rocked the small Lucius without realizing it. His fingers, tense between devotion and terror, cradled him as if holding a poisoned chalice. On the floor, the dry blood of the circle began to crack, and from those fissures sprang impossible geometric shapes, like an arcane language that the very stone itself was revealing. The child, wrapped in a shroud of white linen already stained red where his tiny stigmata wept, neither cried nor breathed with human fragility. He merely fixed his grey eyes on the vault of the crypt, with a supernatural focus, as if he could read in the stone the secret map of the end of times. "The marks," murmured Cardinal Orsini, his voice broken, his hand outstretched toward the infant though he dared not touch him. "They are identical to those of Brother Metatron." His trembling fingers pointed to the tiny wounds on the newborn's palms. They were perfect cuts, like seals engraved with an invisible chisel. But he continued in a whisper, "Why do they not bleed the same?" Metatron slowly lifted his head, and from his own wound still flowed burning blood, falling to the ground like drops of molten iron. His voice broke into a grave murmur. "Because we do not bear the same sins. He has nothing yet to atone for. His flesh does not shed blood, for his judgment has not yet been pronounced. Mine is punishment, his proclamation." A shudder ran through the crypt, the thought that the child's wounds were not redemption, but a living sign that God had shown mercy, or perhaps that he was testing Rome, awaiting the final outcome. The Pope did not answer. His attention remained fixed on the walls of the crypt, where the bones of ancient executed heretics vibrated with a deep hum, like the murmur of bees trapped in stone. The skulls in their niches slowly turned, as if recognizing the newborn with a spectral reverence. Then one of them, a skull etched with Celtic runes, blackened by centuries of silence, detached from its niche and rolled to Calixtus' feet. Its empty sockets lifted toward Lucius with a hypnotic pull, and from between its fleshless jaws issued a hollow, solemn, reverberant voice, like the echo of a judgment sealed since the dawn of time. True empires are not built with glory or sword, but upon the modesty of the unwary, in the minds that allow themselves to be subjugated, like Icarus who drowned in a cup of water. But the hour will come when it will not suffice to merely subdue, but to fight. For those who refuse to bow before Rome must rise in battle alongside Christ, or be devoured by the judgment already advancing, its back pressed against these walls. A shuddering silence followed the prophecy, denser than the stone itself. And in the midst of that void, even the air seemed to await the child's response. The silence was broken by a long, almost metallic screech that resonated through the vaults like the moan of an ancient hinge. From the northern passage emerged 12 figures, aligned in perfect procession, advancing with a cadence as inexorable as the movement of the stars across the celestial vault. They wore black woolen habits, so dense and opaque that they seemed to devour the torchlight, casting shadows more real than their own bodies. No hand, no face was visible beneath the deep hoods, the only certainty was their presence. Yet the most disturbing thing was not what could be seen, but what could be heard, nothing. Neither the rustle of fabric nor the slight touch of their bare feet against the stone made a sound. They advanced in absolute silence, as if the world itself held its breath at their passage. Upon reaching the center of the crypt, they halted. The formation closed into a solemn semicircle around the pontiff and the child, leaving out even the cardinals and Brother Metatron. Then, as if responding to an inaudible command, the 12 figures bowed their heads in unison. The air thickened, imbued with a funerary scent, a blend of myrrh and ancient dust, like the breath of freshly opened tombs. And all understood, though no one spoke it, that this bow was not directed at the Pope, nor at Rome, nor at the Church. It was meant for him alone. For Lucius. Calixtus instinctively pressed the child to his chest, as if that human gesture could defy the inevitable. His voice, hoarse and laden with a tremor that was both fear and defiance, rose amid the echoes of the crypt. Nothing in this Vatican belongs to me, his eyes fixed on the hooded figures, whose presence seemed to absorb every last trace of human warmth, but even less belongs to them. The echo of his words shattered against the stones like a sacrilegious oath. The custodians of silence halted abruptly, and even the air seemed to pause, awaiting a response that would not be spoken with mortal voices, but with the weight of eternal decrees. The leader of the custodians stepped forward, and the silence of the crypt seemed to bow before him. When he extended his bandaged hands, Calixtus noticed that the cloths were soaked with a viscous fluid, thicker than blood, as if distilled from a time before creation itself. With a ritualistic deliberation, the custodian began to unroll the bindings. Then the air became suffocating, in his palms appeared wounds identical to Lucius's, yet there was no glow, no promise of redemption. What flowed was pure corruption, a black, clotted liquid, exuding the stench of sour wine and sulfur, as if each drop had been squeezed from the jaws of the abyss. And as the venom fell to the ground in thick tears, the stones of the Vatican itself groaned, as if recognizing in that infection an ancient master. "We bear the marks as punishment," said Metatron, his voice breaking like burning iron upon the anvil of the world's mystery, while the 11 monks closed an inexorable circle around the Pope. The child, however, carries them as a birthright. There are those who attain purification by entering the enigma of sin and acknowledging the wound it inflicts upon the Holy One. Blessed be he. Yet others, blinded by pride, revel in the pleasures that spring from that very wound, and drink its venom as if it were the ambrosia of the gods. The lead custodian slowly removed his hood, with a ritual deliberation, like one drawing aside a veil in a forbidden sanctuary. His face was no longer entirely flesh, it was a map of interwoven scars, grooves crossing in arcane symbols, inscriptions that seemed to pulse at the very touch of the shadow. Yet still, the most terrible were his eyes, 2 extinguished lanterns, without iris or pupil, blind abysses that devoured light and shattered the will of anyone who dared meet their gaze. Then he opened his mouth, and even the air seemed to recoil, as if fleeing a sacrilege. Where the flesh of a tongue should have moved, there rose a metallic blade, burnished and crude, engraved with verses in a dead language. The torchlight fractured upon that crystallized iron, each flash erupting like a profane lightning, as if the word had been torn from its root and forged into heretical blasphemy. "We are the ones who remember," said the custodian, his voice emerging unnaturally despite his mutilation. "We are the ones who guard the secrets that made Peter weep in the catacombs. The child will be ours." At that moment, Lucius, who until then had remained in an unsettling stillness, raised his tiny arms toward the custodians. His stigmata began to open and bleed for the first time, but unlike the pus-filled wounds of the monks, from his flowed a blood so intensely red it seemed to emit its own light in the gloom. Each drop, upon touching the stone, did not fade, it burned. And in its burn it traced symbols seared into the floor, as if the stone itself recognized a forbidden alphabet. Calixtus felt the papal staff begin to burn in his hand, as if the relic itself rejected his weakness. "What will they teach him?" he murmured, aware that this question was not a challenge, but the confession of one who already knows the battle is lost. The lead custodian bent until he was mere inches from the Pope. His breath reeked of burnt parchment, as if every word had first passed through a purifying fire, not one that destroys, but one that transmutes, elevating the profane into a form darker and more sublime than its predecessor. "We will show him what sleeps beneath the Sistine Chapel," he whispered. "What the mosaics of the basilica murmur when no one listens. We will teach him to read not only between the lines of the Gospels, but also in the pages that are missing." As the custodian spoke, the others began a guttural chant that did not emerge from their sealed mouths, but from their open stigmata, as if the wound itself had learned to intone blasphemous prayers. The walls of the crypt responded to the conjuration, the bones of the executed heretics began to resonate like pipes of an infernal organ, each skeleton vibrating at a different note until they intertwined into an impossible melody, deep and dissonant, making the stone tremble and the teeth in the jaws of the living clatter. Amid the chaos, Lucius began to laugh. His childish laughter intertwined with the guttural chant like a crystal bell amid thunder, rising above the clamor to fracture the air into impossible harmonies. That laughter was not human, it sounded like the rejoicing of angels in their fall, like the echo of the trumpets of the end. The custodians, for the first time, wavered, and the entire crypt seemed to bow to that melody, which tore at the foundations of the world, as if each note heralded the imminent splitting of eternity itself. Calixtus fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the revelation. "He is not a child," he murmured barely above a whisper. "He is a mirror, and he is showing us what was always there, what we never wanted to see." Brother Metatron, weeping tears of blood, stepped forward to take the child from the Pope's arms. "We will raise him in the ambiguity of holiness and sin," he promised in a trembling voice. "Between the divine and the forbidden. For only thus can he fulfill that for which he was conceived, and the purpose the ineffable has charted for this soul. Therefore, a soul that dares to purify itself of its sinful nature must reach beyond even the throne of God, just as the knowledge of the personification of evils constitutes the true holy grail we have come to seek in this world. It is, instead, ignorance that prevents man from seeing beyond what his own corporeal eyes can perceive." Sacred philosophy addresses the how from a more objective and celestial perspective, but those who cling to power and material possessions do not transcend, they remain merely as the personification of evils in their fullest expression, prisoners of their passions, sovereigns of themselves in this valley of tears. Yet still, only the law of him who dictates all laws is the one that begets worlds, asserting itself over the absolute will that upholds the primary foundation of existence, whose traces spill forth in countless forms and manifestations. But the truly essential aspect of the chastisement that scourges peoples is the revelation that every end, no matter how dark it may seem, is ultimately ordered toward a higher good. And when Lucius was finally delivered into the arms of the custodians, all the candles in the crypt ignited at once with a bluish flame, as if the air had inhaled the eternal and the unspeakable. Then a truth arose for which Calixtus could never have been prepared. The bones of the heretics, previously scattered at random along the walls, had silently rearranged themselves, weaving words in a dozen dead languages, all proclaiming the same thing. The judgment is coming. The sacred lie. The crypt of the custodian smelled of melted wax and congealed blood. Metatron sharpened his obsidian knife with ceremonial movements of high magic. Each stroke of the blade against the whetstone, inscribed with ancient runes, sounded like a long-forgotten spell. The sharp, piercing echo spilled across the walls covered with forbidden manuscripts, fragments of the Zohar HaKadosh, the Sefer Raziel HaMalek, and other volumes whose reading had driven more than one monk to madness, until the clergy were forced to seal them in the silence of prohibition. Now, however, that forbidden knowledge belonged to the custodians, guardians of the accursed, a sect of veiled faces sheltered beneath the forgotten clusters of Rome's ornaments, hiding beneath the purple and incense the shadow of a pact older than the church itself, darker than the empires that still sought to rule over the faith. "We will instruct him in the psalms of the eternal," he murmured suddenly, raising the blade toward the faint candlelight, as if seeking in it a secret testimony, a veiled echo of deafening auguries. "We will teach him the rites of purification and the paths of penance, those to be forged with iron and flame upon the promised Lamb, the one who will bear the weight of all our sins and redeem us in his martyred flesh, for the glory of the church and the salvation of us all." From the shadows, custodian number 4, guardian of the prophetic texts, let out a harsh laugh, like iron tearing stone. "And when, brother, will we show him the other psalms? Those David wrote after ordering the death of Uriah? The ones that were torn from the codices and condemned to silence?" Metatron did not raise his gaze. "All in due time," he said with a voice of judgment, while the blade danced across the stone as if seeking a millennia-old echo within it. First he must be satisfied with the official version, before his lips dare taste the hidden variations, those veiled letters whose secrets ultimately shatter weak minds. "What do you mean by that?" replied the fourth silent monk, his voice breaking the gloom like a restrained echo. "Are you suggesting that the scriptures are nothing more than a half-told truth? That would be a fallacy, but a fallacy that, after all, grants us the bliss of belief and keeps us within the illusion of happiness." This time, Metatron fixed his gaze on the fourth silent monk. "Water pierces the rock where its layer is weakest. In the same way, empires find the cracks where instability takes hold, fragmenting them from within, from the very bowels of their rulers." Amid conversations that were meant to remain buried in the forgetfulness of those reinforced walls, the refuge of the custodians of silence, Lucius, now 6 months old, crawled in the center of the room atop a mosaic of bones arranged in the shape of a cross. His tiny fingers traced the lines between the bone pieces with a naive innocence that both creates and destroys at once, as if following an invisible pattern dictated by the universe. Each time he brushed against a particular bone, it emitted a faint hum, akin to the tinkling of a tawny cat meowing across the rooftops of Venice, and in the child's eyes ignited a fearless curiosity, a precocious intrigue for mysteries that would make any other of his kind tremble. Custodian number 7, the youngest of the order, watched with reverent astonishment. "See how he converses with the remnants of the enlightened," he whispered, his voice trembling, almost as one who prays. It is as if, in his innocence, he recognized them one by one in the greatness of what they once were, as if their bones still held the memory of their magnificence. "Perhaps he does recognize them," Metatron replied dryly. At last, he set aside the knife he had been sharpening for some time and approached the child. The memory of blood is vast, brother, vaster and older than the Church allows us to remember. A shiver ran through the chamber as Lucius, without warning, stopped before a skull etched with Coptic symbols, guarded by a candle gasping its final breath of wax. His tiny hands rested upon the yellowed, bony forehead, and for a moment, the air filled with the sweet scent of orange blossom and ascending spirals of smoke, fragrances that had not dared touch these walls for entire centuries. Bishop Theophilus intoned custodian number 2, his voice trembling as if naming a ghost. He who dared render the Gospels in the vernacular, breaking the wall of mystery. He was thrown into the flames in the year of our Lord 1023, consumed along with his manuscripts. Yet not even fire could erase his words, his ashes still drift in the world's air, awaiting the day they return as a blazing omen upon us. Lucius turned toward them, and a perennial glow blazed in his eyes, a light that belonged neither to any child nor, perhaps, to any human creature. Then, with the execrable clarity of a sentence and the solemn weight of an omen carrying centuries of silence and the Vatican's ostentatious abuses, he uttered a single word, the first since the Amen, buried in the months past, fire. All the custodians present looked at one another. Metatron was the first to react. Kneeling before the child, he took his tiny right hand and placed it upon one of the freshly sharpened knives, still gleaming with obsidian. "Yes, little one, fire," he whispered. "The fire that purges. The fire that conceals. The fire that returns words to the silence from which they emerged. The eternal fire of material purification and the immortal consummation of the human soul." And the child, still lacking the vocabulary the world demands, seemed nonetheless to understand far beyond the empty words uttered by Brother Metatron, even without ever having witnessed them. For in his silence blazed an archetypal splendor, as if a language older than mankind itself resonated in his ears. And anyone who witnessed that scene would know, with bitter certainty, that the destiny reserved for him would be no less terrible than that of a church corrupted by its own abuses and vices. Custodian number 5, usually the most reserved, stepped forward. "It is far too soon for this. The council decreed that we should not begin his training until he reaches 7 years of age, when his mind can be considered capable." Metatron answered, leaving no room for doubt. "This is the child who, by the permission of Almighty God, through the intercession of the devil, and by the consummation of the corporeal act erected as both dome and crucible of the universe, rises as the great Hierophant and Emperor of Rome. In him, a before and an after will intertwine within the possible destinies of the reality we are to preserve." Metatron replied in a voice of firm authority. The council did not foresee that the child would remember on his own, for all wisdom dwells in the soul, not in the fleeting intellect. With coldly calculated movements, he carefully wrapped Lucius's tiny hand around one of the knives he customarily sharpened and consecrated in the rituals. See how he holds it, as if he already knows its weight and its purpose. That of a warrior who will not only face the outside world, but also his own nature and the irrevocable turn of his destined path. Lucius, indeed, handled the weapon with an unsettling familiarity and understanding. And when the blade reflected the trembling candlelight, the symbols engraved in the obsidian seemed to shiver and rearrange themselves, as if seeking new secret combinations, hidden within the arcane mystery of the stone that had been brought to the ritual. "The language of the angels," murmured custodian number 3, his voice trembling with reverence. "It is translating itself for him, a metaphorical language of heaven, which only a mind willing to purge the weight of its destiny can comprehend. The Almighty's chosen. The initiate into non-mortal realms." At that moment, the door to the crypt and refuge of the custodian swung open with a sharp bang that shattered the calm, like a harbinger of ill omen. Custodian number 12, guardian of the Vatican's secret movements, burst in, his breath ragged and his eyes clouded with urgency. "The Pope has sent emissaries," he announced in a commanding voice, carrying with it the echo of distant bells. "They inquire about the child. They demand to see the progress of his sacred education." A tense silence filled the chamber. Metatron, unhurried, took the knife from Lucius's hands and concealed it within his robes. Then we shall show them progress, he said at last, with a calm that hung like lead in the air. Prepare the hall of relics. And bring the white linen shroud. As the other custodians dispersed to carry out their orders, Metatron lifted Lucius into his arms. Now we shall play a game, little one, he whispered into his ear, with an unsettling tenderness. One where you shall be the miraculous saint, and we your humble servants. Will you be able to shed tears of silver when I ask it of you? Lucius looked at him with those eyes far too wise for so young a creature. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he extended his tiny hand, already marked by the stigmata, toward Metatron's cheek. And upon contact, the monk's wounds, which had suppurated for decades as a perpetual reminder of hidden sins, ceased to bleed. A sepulchral silence descended upon the crypt, as if even the stones understood that the course of destiny had just been broken, or added to the vast accumulation of sin still awaiting comprehension, endurance, and, at last, redemption. Well played, Metatron conceded with a crooked smile. This is how we shall proceed. We will show them just enough of the truth for them to believe the lie. Only by delineating the boundaries and walls of this empire as far as the limits of the minds of the unwary can perceive. When the papal emissaries arrived, they found a carefully orchestrated scene, Lucius, dressed in immaculate white, seated serenely upon a velvet cushion, while the custodians chanted psalms around him and recited the holy scriptures, interwoven with appropriate verses and mystical revelations that reflected the sacred worldview. As they approached, the child extended his hands toward them, and to everyone's astonishment, the stigmata on his flesh began to radiate a pure, blinding golden light, as if the very heavens had descended into the crypt to witness that sacred tableau. A miracle, whispered one of the priests, collapsing to his knees as if the weight of the divine had shattered his earthly will. A miracle is, murmured another of the accompanying priests, bowing forward with vehement intensity, as if to make clear that in his faith there was no room for doubt or heresy. Metatron, prostrate behind the child, exchanged a silent glance with the other custodians. What the emissaries could not perceive was the obsidian knife hidden beneath Lucius's cushion, nor how the bones embedded in the walls trembled rhythmically with his presence, resonating to the cadence of a sepulchral choir that heralded the end of days. There, in that shiver of lime and marrow, forbidden messages blurred, signs that only the initiated could decipher, fragments of an apocalypse not yet manifested, yet already sealed in the inexorable destiny of the impious. The child progresses as foreseen, declared Metatron in a solemn voice. God has filled his little soul with extraordinary graces, intelligence, lucidity, and a fervent love for the Lord. As the emissaries admired the little saint, Lucius turned his head toward Metatron. For a fleeting instant, his childish expression transfigured into something far more intuitive, perceptive, and, at the same time, calculating. A gaze that promised nothing but complicity in deception and mischief in redemption. And in that moment, Metatron knew that the greatest lie was not the one they were telling the Vatican, but the one they themselves had begun to believe, that they could control what they had helped bring into being, without understanding the repercussions it would entail. Chapter 5, The Convent of Silver Tears. Psalm 139 verses 11 to 12. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, even the night will shine around me. Darkness cannot conceal me from you, and the night glows as the day. To you, darkness and light are the same. The Golden Prison. A black carriage came to a halt before the towering walls of Santa Maria del Lanto just as the first light of dawn began to tear the sky with pale, blood-tinged fingers. The convent rose upon a forgotten cliff, on one of the 7 hills that enclosed the holy city, like the empire that reigned over all empires upon the face of the earth, its neoclassical towers and ivy-clad battlements casting shadows long as knives across the deserted courtyard. Its walls, steeped in centuries of prayers and forgiven secrets, bore also the traces of precursor cultures that imprinted their memory upon the labyrinthine living consciousness of this special place, almost forgotten since the emergence of heretics, whose only fates preserved the echo of prayers wrung from the desperation of the faithful and the silence of the damned. Isadora de Lunae, her hands bound by thick silk ribbons soaked in holy water and consecrated to the sacred light of the Holy Spirit, felt those makeshift shackles burn her skin. This was no ordinary fabric, but fragments of Christ's shroud, interwoven with desecrated crucifixes and ritualized by the most renowned theurgists of the empire, tools designed to claim, subdue, and bend the power of anyone, as part of the plan of the most cunning strategist of the medieval world, keeping minds under the enforced calm of the ignorance of the flock that Pope Calixtus sought to shepherd. "Down," commanded the papal guard, pushing open the carriage door with a cold, cutting disdain. Isadora descended with dignity, though each movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her. Her bare feet touched the damp earth, and for a fleeting moment she felt the pulse of life beneath her soles. But that contact was brief. Two nuns with gaunt, sharp-featured faces seized her by the arms, dragging her mercilessly toward the convent entrance. "Is this the famed witch?" the voice echoed from the shadows, like a whisper tearing through the silence with the tension of an imminent omen, heralding the arrival of storms and the fall of eras. A tall woman, with sharp features and steel-grey eyes, emerged from the shadows. She wore the black habit of the Sisters of Silence, but her cloak was embroidered with golden threads tracing intricate alchemical symbols, gleaming like fragments of forbidden knowledge. "Sister Abigail," murmured one of the nuns, bowing her head with reverential respect. "She has been brought by direct order of the Holy Office." Abigail approached, studying Isadora with the same cold detachment a surgeon observes a corpse, measuring every detail with clinical precision and taking meticulous mental notes without ever averting her gaze. "So you are the one who shook the very foundations of the Vatican," whispered Abigail, raising her hand as if to touch not only Isadora's face but also the essence that had shaken the pillars of the world, measuring with an intimidating gesture the tremor of her untouchable power. But before her fingers could even brush her skin, Isadora turned her head, evading the contact with a cold, defiant grace. "Do not touch me," she warned, her voice echoing like a bell tolling across a desolate valley. Abigail remained unmoved, like an onyx statue watching without blinking. "Here you hold no power," which, Abigail stated, her voice firm and cutting. "Within these walls, there is only room for penance and repentance." "Repentance?" Isadora let out a bitter laugh. "What you call repentance is nothing more than another vile form of torture." Abigail remained silent. Without uttering a word, she raised her hand, and the other nuns guided Isadora toward the shadowed interior of the convent. The main cloister rose like a nightmare sanctuary, a theater where the sacred merged with the macabre. Its walls, covered in frescoes depicting saints on their customary pilgrimages, shimmered under the flickering light of hundreds of candles and black tapers, casting shadows that danced like specters condemned to eternal modesty. Yet the most terrifying aspect lay in the rotted cells, blackened like abysses of dismay, confusion, and revulsion, where the air hung heavy with the raw despair of their last occupants, and time itself seemed broken, awaiting the arrival of a fate more dreadful and nauseating than the place that would come to call home. The closer she approached, the more she realized these were no ordinary cells, nor even what they appeared to be at first glance, but small chambers lined with gold on the inside, each protected by a curtain of golden thread instead of doors. Behind them, Isadora could discern the other prisoners. Some, young women with gaunt faces, wept silently while nuns in leather gloves collected their tears in crystal jars. Others, older, had their eyelids sewn shut with silver thread, unable to close their eyes. "What have you done to them?" Isadora demanded, feeling her anger begin to boil within her like an uncontainable fire. "We have given them purpose," Abigail replied, advancing alongside her with measured steps. "Their tears are sacred. Each drop is worth more than its weight in gold, for upon them rests the merciful benefaction of the Creator. The tears of martyrs are the first to reach Him, souls of contrite heart that cry out to the Lord and conjure the revelation of the Creator through their deeds, inspired by mankind. They are people, not livestock," Isadora shouted, struggling to free herself from the nuns who held her. Abigail stopped, turning to look at her with a cold, merciless smile. "Here, they are only what the Church decrees them to be. And you, Isadora de Lunae, will be our most exalted producer. It is not about what the saints can do for us, but about how we perceive the saints and our apostolic, Roman Church in our lives, dispelling from them the meaninglessness that weighs upon men and drags them into madness, even if, in the process, we must fill the coffers as the Church's tribute and thus exercise God's dominion over the temple that dwells within every human body. The cell assigned to her was narrow and sticky, barely large enough for a person to stand. Yet its walls were lined with sheets of gold so thin they quivered with every movement, and from the ceiling hung a silver funnel, perfectly aligned with her eyes, like an alembic distilling into a crucible, channeling the machinery of sin and redemption to the highest bidder. "Here you will weep," Abigail said, tightening the ribbons that bound Isadora's wrists to hooks on the wall. "And your tears will be the irrefutable proof of your repentance, the very fuel that warms the thick walls of the sacred palaces during the harsh southern winter." "I will never repent," Isadora whispered, locking her golden eyes onto Abigail's in a silent duel of defiance and caution. The nun remained unmoved. "Everyone cries in the end." With those words, Abigail left the cell, leaving Isadora alone in her golden prison, a tiny space of enforced productivity, her tribute to faith, dictated by the gilded demands of the Vatican's sacred mandate. Her devotion, therefore, was to be tested against the measure of unconditional love. The hours passed more slowly than usual. Isadora, exhausted yet steadfast in her refusal to succumb to despair and anguish, kept her eyes dry. Yet then she heard a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sob, emanating from the neighboring cell. "Who's there?" she asked, leaning toward the golden threaded curtain. I'm Elena," came a trembling voice. "I've been here for 3 years." Isadora felt a knot tighten in her stomach, as if shadows had coiled within her, and her very insides whispered the weight of unspoken years of captivity. "Why are you crying?" "Because I can no longer stop myself," Elena replied between sobs. "They have taken everything from me, even my tears no longer belong to me." Isadora closed her eyes, letting anger and sorrow intertwine, only to dissolve afterward into a silent whirlwind within her chest. "Listen to me, Elena," she said, lowering her voice. "You are not alone. I promise you, you will leave this place." "No one leaves Santa Maria del Lanto," Elena murmured. "This place is cursed." At that moment, the curtain of Isadora's cell was drawn aside, revealing Abigail, who held a small glass vial in her hand. Isadora closed her eyes, letting anger and sorrow intertwine, only to dissolve into a silent whirlwind that spun within her chest, heavy with the weight of inevitable resignation. "It is time to collect," she announced, a smile playing on her lips that never reached her eyes. Isadora lifted her head, defiant this time. "You will not have my tears." Abigail remained silent. Instead, she raised her hand in a subtle, commanding gesture, and 2 nuns swiftly entered the cell, carrying between their fingers a pair of silver tongs that gleamed with an almost furtive intensity, as if the metal itself bore the memory of ancient torments and the panic of those who had endured them. "Everyone cries in the end," Abigail repeated as the nuns drew nearer. "Some just need a little motivation." The pain was unbearable. The tongs, heated until they glowed red, clamped down on Isadora's arms, forcing a scream from her lips. Yet even then, her eyes remained dry. And suddenly, once more, the blazing tongs were lifted and pressed against the glowing embers. As a harbinger of even greater torment, the pain became unbearable when those metal jaws, searing red-hot, clamped down again on Isadora's arms, tearing a wrenching scream from her lips. Yet, even in the midst of this agony, her eyes remained dry, defiantly resisting the fate they sought to impose upon her. "I won't do it," Isadora cried, writhing in vain, like a body cast into the merciless jaws of fate. Abigail, frustration blazing across her face, commanded that the punishment be intensified. Yet, just as the nuns moved to press the searing tongs into Isadora's flesh for a 3rd time, the unexpected erupted like an omen in the shadowed void of oblivion. A single tear, defiant and radiant, traced its way down Isadora's cheek, as if the very heavens had chosen to shatter in a lone flash of pain and defiance. Abigail smiled, triumphant and haughty, and held out the vial to collect the first tear. But the moment the crystal touched it, it shattered into 1,000 shards, violently scattering the fragments. The tear, wild and untamable, fell onto the nun's hand, staining her grim habit, as if the very wrath of heaven had exacted vengeance on her arrogant, merciless gesture. Abigail's scream echoed throughout the convent. Isadora's tear was no mere saline drop, it was something more, alive, burning, incorruptible. It seared the nun's flesh like divine acid, leaving a blackened, smoking mark that spread along her arm with the relentless hunger of a condemnation etched into living tissue. "It's the devil!" shouted one of the nuns, recoiling in terror. Isadora, despite the sting of humiliation, smiled, as if within that burning wound she had discovered a secret triumph that neither fire nor flesh could deny. "It is not the devil," she said, as the ribbons binding her began to smolder. "It is divine justice." Chaos erupted within Santa Maria del Lanto. The prisoner's tears, long confined in silence, began to boil like storm-tossed seas within their crystal vials, shattering the glass and spilling their searing fury onto the hands of the nuns, who howled as their flesh seared. The golden curtains ignited in ravenous flames, casting a sacrilegious glow along the corridors, while the convent's walls quaked as if the very bowels of the earth were tearing apart, unleashing an ancient, terrifying awakening, a harbinger of inescapable judgment. Abigail, her hand still smoking and blackened like a dying ember from hell, lifted her gaze toward Isadora. In her eyes danced both hatred and terror, as if she were staring not at a prisoner, but at the harbinger of a cursed prophecy. Her face, once stone-cold and haughty, cracked into a grimace of impotent fury, while the air around her seemed to blaze with portents of chaos and ruin. "What have you done?" she asked, staggering. Isadora, now free from her bonds, rose with a dignity and majesty that seemed not of this world. Her silhouette, etched against the flames and smoke, resembled an angel hewn from stone, forged to withstand storms atop a cathedral dome, a statue of rebellion standing eternally against the heavens themselves. Most striking were her golden eyes, ablaze with a light alien to flesh, a will-o'-the-wisp fire that heralded the crumbling of temples and the fall of crowns. Around her, chaos roared like an apocalyptic choir, and every tear once enslaved now soared as a trumpet of judgment. "What I should have done long ago." With those words, she extended her arms, and the tears of all the imprisoned women rose into the air, lifting from the shattered vials like stars torn from the firmament. A silver, vibrant, ethereal river began to flow toward her, twisting through the air as if obeying a divine law unpenned by human hands. Each droplet shone like an incandescent mirror of earthly misery, and together they formed a celestial torrent that illuminated the convent's shadows with iridescent flashes, as if judgment itself were seeping through the narrow crevices of the enclosure. In its entirety, that river was both redemption and condemnation, coiling around her like a fleeting crown, forged to herald the coming of the end times. "This place will fall," she proclaimed, her voice no longer human. "And you shall fall with it." It was not divine law that dictated the grievous consequences of unchecked ambition, a shadowed seed sown in man before God had dreamed him into eternity, but the conception that must govern every mind eager and fearful of the sacred, the relentless pursuit of wisdom, as if within it lay the promise of the Creator's salvation. Yet such salvation is but a delirious mirage, born of the ignorance that precedes reason, a feverish radiance cast upon the mutable face of the world, where even heretics, with profane hands, unknowingly place each stone in the earthly temple of God and his sovereign delegate, destined, in the vertigo of time, to become both co-participants and co-artisans of the supreme work of creation, their own fragile humanity. That very world intertwines the primordial substance of human reality, the realm in which we dwell, or believe we dwell, where mental and earthly spheres emerge from a mutable symbiosis with the nascent outer world, as well as from the redefinition of archaic symbols, figures, and mechanisms of power, all legitimized and perpetuated by institutions fashioned by man and sanctioned by God. In the wake of the events at the convent of Santa Maria del Lanto, far from the Vatican, Lucius's stigmata reopened, not as mere wounds upon flesh, but as incandescent fissures tearing through the woven veil of the anima mundi. From his hands and feet flowed a dark, solemn river, coursing over the consecrated marble and staining it with the weight of centuries of unatoned sins and withered remorse. Each drop, striking the stone, rang out like an unseen clarion, a harbinger of inevitable ruin, and the marble angels, perched high atop the domes, bowed their faces toward the earth, not in prayer, but in silent weeping. His gesture was a blazing jewel, a prelude to the wrath to come, a silent herald of a judgment that no mortal hand could ever avert. As an unceasing prelude of evil, the Tiber revealed the irrefutable sign of the curse. Its waters turned black, dense as a moonless night in the harshest depths of winter. The riverbed, once gentle, now carried the wandering shadows of purgatory, and each wave crashed against the banks like a striking lament, as if the eternal city were at last drinking from the poisoned cup it had itself prepared, in the complicit silence of Rome and all who upheld it. Divine punishment. The scream of Sister Abigail thundered through the marble cloisters, a cry so harrowing that it drove the other nuns to cross themselves at once, as though to ward off the devil himself, offering them his temptations. Isadora's tear still burned in Abigail's right palm, carving a black furrow that spread like fire over gunpowder, consuming flesh and tendon until the bleached bone of her fingers lay exposed, gleaming like a macabre relic amid the gloom. "Sever her hand," commanded Prioress Margareta, staggering back with her face contorted, while the stench of charred flesh thickened the air. "Before the curse spreads among us like the Black Plague, dispatched from hell itself." But it was already too late. The decree had been sealed in the silence of the cloister, and what burned in Abigail's flesh was not mere fire, but the proclamation of a cataclysm inscribed before time itself. Indeed, the blood that dripped from Abigail's wound was no longer red. It shimmered with a silvery hue, thick as mercury, and wherever it splattered across the floor mosaics, the images of saints writhed and screamed in agonized torment. The younger nuns began to pray aloud, their voices trembling with desperate fervor, yet their prayers slowly dissolved into broken cries as their own tears overwhelmed them. At the far end of the row of annex cells, the tears of the captives, hoarded for years, began to bubble and churn within the reliquary jars. Isadora, faltering beneath the weight of her own strength and convictions, beheld the chaos with a bewildered calm. "I told you my tears were not for you," she whispered, as the last chains that bound her began to glow red-hot. "They are for him, and for him alone." The blood of the innocent is woven into the unfathomable designs of the martyrs' souls, which, by their unyielding conviction, become the catalyst for an unbreakable rupture in the minds of the masses and in the entrenched structures of power. Yet before such a transformation can come to pass, much blood must be spilled to enthrone a will alien and disruptive, shattering the established order and the secret workings of authority, those hidden mechanisms that only the chosen are born to wield. Some laugh, others weep, in the valley of tears we ourselves have forged. In the eastern wing of the convent, where the maidens of weeping were confined, women whose only crime was to bear sacred visions, the walls began to sweat. It was not water, an oily substance, reeking of myrrh and sulfur, slid down like a living shadow. Sister Clara, the youngest among the gatherers, was the first to notice it when she tried to wipe the face of a prisoner. "Mother of God," she whispered, snatching her hand back. "They're tears, they're hot." The prisoner, a girl of no more than 16, named Bianca, lifted her face. Her eyes, once dulled by suffering, now blazed with a golden light. "They are not my tears," she replied, her voice resounding like a choir both celestial and accursed. "They are hers." And then she began to sing. Not in Latin, nor in Greek, but in a tongue that tore at the ears of all who heard it. The nuns collapsed to their knees, covering their ears, yet the sound did not come from without. It reverberated inside their skulls, as though their very thoughts had turned against them, as if the whole world were bleeding out from within. Thus is the judgment of angels measured, by the exactitude of man's merit upon the earth, cast without mercy into the instinctive designs of the flesh, into the shifting sands of adverse conditions that weigh down the soul's free ascent. From such abysses alone can there be born a harvest calculated by unscrupulous desires, desires that sprout and entwine like a tree of Lebanon. Yet what springs from its root is not conversion, but dogmatization, a withered decree that fastens chains upon what was meant to be free. For, in truth, no freedom can be conceived apart from a higher structure, one that displaces, conditions, and molds the reality beneath it, transfiguring every attempt at emancipation into nothing more than an echo of its will. Unexpectedly, in the convent chapel, the frescoes of the Virgin and the saints began to writhe. Their pigments liquefied, sliding down the walls like tears of corrosive oil, and the figures once deemed pious revealed their true faces, demons with grotesque smiles that rent the spirit, angels with hollow eyes and stitched mouths, condemned to whisper forbidden secrets to wandering souls. The chapel itself seemed to draw breath, an exhalation of darkness, a murmur of judgment that seeped through the walls and pierced the souls of those who perceived it, leaving within them an indelible trembling. Prioress Margarita, crawling across the floor with her habit engulfed in flames, managed to catch sight of the great crucifix. The figure of Christ was not suffering. He was laughing. A laughter that tore through the air like a herald of fire and ash, an echo of celestial judgments twisted into blasphemy. His eyes blazed with the light of damnation, and his open mouth spewed forth a terrible joy, infecting the chapel's silence with a horror so absolute that even the stone itself seemed to tremble. "This is the devil's work," she cried, spitting out a tooth that had come loose, a shard of her trembling flesh. "Exorcise that witch, before she consumes the last of our souls." But when she turned toward Isadora's narrow cell, she found nothing but severed bonds and a pool of that same silvery substance spreading across the floor like a fatal ultimatum, reflecting a world splintering in silence, awaiting its total collapse. And at the center, carved by seared fingers, a message rose like a final omen. "Your God does not come to save you. He comes to claim what has always been his." The very air seemed to tremble at such words, and the chapel itself breathed a judgment that loomed, inescapably, over all you had once believed secure. What is dreamlike about the theme is that it harbors the very mechanisms which unveil a heresy born from the established powers themselves. Thus, the price of blasphemy becomes tolerably acceptable. Yet the true burden is moral repression, carried by all alike, from executioners to the executed, each a part of a superficial theater, fulfilling their stage role and obeying the faithful mandate of their own desires. All this unfolds as a perpetual drama, the product of a dissonant dichotomy, where time and conscience stand opposed in the distant silence of God, reminding us that apparent freedom is ever an illusion, conditioned by structures that precede and transcend us. Can a soul, then, discover its true path and its reason for being? Reality broke in with a tangible violence. Outside, in the central courtyard, the surviving nuns huddled around the sacred well. The water, once clear, had now turned black and viscous, like a mirror of darkness reflecting the judgment contained in the mythical tales of the plagues of Egypt. When Sister Clara tried to draw some out, the rope snapped with an almost imperceptible crack, as though divine will had descended upon the earth with relentless fury. From the depths arose something inconceivable. It was not water. It was hands. Dozens of them, pale and drenched in that silvery substance which seemed to distill the very essence of death, clung to the rim of the well like the gnarled roots of a tree doomed to fall. The women who had perished in Santa Maria del Lanto, those who wept until their souls were emptied, those secretly buried beneath the foundations, were returning, dragging with them the eternal lament of their bodies and the silent wrath of their memories. And they did not come alone. Bodiless whispers mingled with the frigid air, the chapel held its breath, trembling before the rising of what the earth had long forgotten. Isadora walked among them, barefoot, her prisoner's dress now white as freshly fallen snow. In her hand she held a vial. Within it, suspended in that silvery liquid that seemed to mirror death itself, floated the left eye of Sister Abigail, like a small sun of horror, casting its light upon the darkness of the courtyard and the shuddering of the souls gathered there. "Tell your Pope," she murmured, letting the vial fall into the well. "His time is running out." The sound of glass shattering against the black water resounded like an omen, and the air was filled with a silence so absolute it seemed to hold within it the very sentence of the heavens. the water burst into a silver geyser that lit the sky of Rome like a second dawn, a spark that tinged the sunrise, spilling its light across the city as an unmistakable sign of what had always been reality. Not through any magnanimous intent, but one tainted and corrupted by ambition, even death itself might have been a kinder fate than a destiny broken by corrupt and tainted laws, which carry with them a torment more agonizing and desolate than any empire could ever conceive. What seems evil is not so evil if upon it rests the survival of a kingdom perpetuated in filth. And in the Vatican, just a few kilometers away, young Lucius awoke unsettled amid a mystical epiphany, as though the vision of that infernal radiance had pierced not only the walls but the very souls of men, awakening visions and hidden understandings deeper than anything Adam Kadmon himself could have ever attained. Namely, those who feed on the memories of the past to perpetuate a system that devours yet never loses its voracious essence, lay the first stone of ethereal palaces and raise kingdoms upon the earth. For one cannot exist without the other, like a faith rooted as much in the soil as in the heavens. Yet true liberation, the seizing of the reins of the winged steed, first requires the usurpation of worldly empires, in order to wield absolute control and subjugate the higher will, unfolding a power that lays claim to the visible and the invisible, the human and the divine. Her stigmata, for the first time in her brief existence, found a strange solace in hearing a secret that had fallen into the abyss of the world and, against all odds, had been recovered. For that alone, it had been worth incarnating. In her palms, meanwhile, words appeared, engraved and even more luminous and hopeful despite the perpetual chaos, making clear the next step that this cursed story would take. It is coming.